How you doing? Here we go. We're going to move on to a conversation about muscles, exercise, and steroids. And you're probably thinking, we've already discussed a little bit about exercise, and that's true. But based on some comments and questions I've been getting in class, I want to add just a little bit of that as you begin to finish up the muscle unit. So, when we talk about this term, muscular hypertrophy, that really refers to the increase in muscle size based upon activity. Muscle is in some ways kind of like bones. We talked about osteoblasts producing extra bone when there was stress on the bone. Muscles do the same thing. Muscles are going to change based upon the amount of work that they do or they don't do. So we got this guy right here, and you see that he's lost some weight, and you also see some definition to his muscles. He has done a couple of different kinds of exercises to achieve that, but we're going to focus here on the muscular hypertrophy. How do muscles get larger? So, you've seen this chart, this diagram before, but I want to go back over the basic of it so that you are clear what's being shown here. Again, in response to a workload, and I'm talking here about resistance exercise, we're distinguishing between endurance and resistance. So focused on resistance, as in someone's lifting weights. The number of nuclei in each muscle fiber increases, but not due to muscle fiber mitosis. We are fairly convinced that when people are lifting weights, they're not actually adding muscle fibers, that is muscle cells, to their muscles. They're actually adding nuclei, which ultimately will add more myofibrils. So again, back to the chart you've already seen before, but here is a resting myofiber, and then with some myotrauma, with some weightlifting, some satellite cells that are nearby get recruited, and they become part of that injured muscle fiber. You see the addition here, they will then stimulate the production of more myofibrils within the muscle fiber itself. So the muscle will get larger if you have this myotrauma followed by the recruitment of these satellite cells, followed by more myofibrils coming in. So that is one way that muscle fibers get larger, and therefore the whole muscle organ gets larger. Recall also we mentioned you can have muscles get larger based on increased fluid content, but here we're talking about adding the proteins, adding the myofibrils from resistance exercise. So the nuclei come in and they help take over and increase the myofibril concentration. Also, though, as muscles are going through resistance exercise, they are going to stimulate the production of more blood vessels, more mitochondria, more connective tissue. So all of these are things that are going to help contribute to an increase in muscle hypertrophy, muscles getting larger. Do you have to lift weights, though, to make muscles get larger? And the short answer is no, but you have to provide resistance exercise. Other kinds of exercise may increase muscle endurance, but in this case, for example, if you're using bands, if you're using isometric exercises, you're pushing on your own arms and your own strength this way, that is still creating muscle contractions, that is still creating some resistance. So you don't have to lift weights, but you have to do some kind of resistance exercise to get significant muscle hypertrophy. That said, when men and women are going to be doing resistance training, they're going to get somewhat different results, similar but somewhat different. Why do they see different results? Men are more likely to see increased muscle volume. Men are going to be producing more proteins at a bit higher rate because of testosterone influences, for example, and that's going to cause them to develop more definition in general with their muscles in women. And men tend to have stronger tendons associated with their muscles. They tend to be a little bit larger. So when men are lifting weights, they tend to have a little more protection from injury, from tendon injuries, for example, than women do. Again, but that's not to say that women can't significantly improve muscle mass, muscle strength, and muscle flexibility. So we don't really see then any difference in the types of exercises they're doing. Both genders can lift weights. Calorie and protein intake is largely a function of body size and the kind of training and weight goals they have. So men may again have a higher calorie requirement, they may have a higher protein requirement, but it doesn't mean that women may not also have to increase their calories and proteins at proportional amounts to see some effects also. So we generally see what you see here in this diagram. Men tend to get more definition to their muscles because they can get more muscle hypertrophy than women, but women can also get extremely strong and increase their muscle mass as well, just not quite the same definition. Which brings us to, and let me go away for a second here, which brings us to a conversation about anabolic and androgenic steroids. They tend to have a bad rap, and the rap is largely due to how they can be abused. But as I have here, these steroids are not all bad. Some of these uses are a little older than we use currently, but we used to use anabolic and androgenic steroids for treatment of anemia, growth disorders, and even to induce puberty in males. There are other ways of doing that now, so anabolic steroids tend to be not quite so used for these purposes, but where we run into the big concern about steroids is, well, let me back up for a second. How do they work? They stimulate protein metabolism, and they do work similar to testosterone. Why you see the term up there, anabolic and androgenic. Androgenic ones are those that really do mimic more of the male sex differentiation that we associate with males. Anabolic steroids by themselves can be reformulated so they don't have quite as many secondary sex characteristic effects. But what they do in general are these two things. They're going to help stimulate protein metabolism, that is making more protein, and they also reduce natural muscle catabolism. Again, think about bone. Bone had osteoblasts and osteoclasts that work somewhat in balance. Muscle is going to have something similar, where there's proteins that are going to be produced and proteins that will be broken down to keep the muscle tissue vibrant and fresh. So what these steroids tend to do is they both promote protein metabolism, the anabolic building side, and they also reduce the natural catabolism side of muscles, so that you get the extra benefit. You're adding growth and you're not taking anything away, which is why the muscle growth tends to occur as fast as it does. But then again, we end up with this concern when you use these for what's called ergogenic purposes. That is to use them to increase, not for medical purposes, but for athletic performance. You're going to increase muscle mass, and hopefully, and that's how they've been typically used, to recover from injury. And again, it's not as if these things cannot have some therapeutic value. However, when they're used illicitly, or they're used without a doctor's orders, or they're used to create extra muscle mass, even with significant risks, then we run into a big problem. Some of the side effects we see with these are, as you see listed here, cholesterol changes, which can be quite dangerous. Acne, you tend to see a lot of acne in some people that are abusing steroids. Impaired liver function, enlargement of the left ventricle of the heart, and many times this is going to be leading to a cause of death. That football players, for example, have taken steroids for a long period of time, may have heart failure in their 50s because they have this natural enlargement of the left ventricle. And while that may seem a good thing to have a large heart, the heart gets larger, but the space inside the heart gets smaller, so they don't have enough blood volume being pumped out, which can be a severe complication. And you've probably heard of this term, roid rage. People who abuse anabolic steroids or take them for a long period of time can have some psychological changes that may cause them to do some rather extreme things. But I show you this. Arnold Schwarzenegger has acknowledged that he was taking steroids for a long time, and you see how much muscle definition and mass he has, and that actually inspires a lot of people. And you see the stat there at the bottom that over 1.5 million teens admit to using anabolic steroids. Some of them are using it just to look a little bit better for the beach. Some of them are trying to get better for performance. But again, look at the side effects, and we're going to have a lot of kids who are going to have a lot of issues with steroids in the future. Finally, I just want to give you one slide of the opposite. Rather than building up muscle, what about atrophy? As I mentioned before, there is this natural balance between protein synthesis and muscle breakdown. So disuse leads to less stimulation of protein synthesis, and as we see here in the slide, obviously this person's right leg was casted, and you can see that how much mass we have on one side and how much loss of mass we have on the other. So this person probably was having a lot of disuse and therefore some muscle atrophy excuse me, associated with that muscle. And we see the same thing down here as well. So atrophy can result from lots of conditions besides just not using it. Malnutrition, AIDS, cancer, COPD, renal failure, major burns, denervation, all these things. If we're not getting sufficient muscle materials to build from, or we have some severe physiology processes where we're not adequately supplying muscle with nutrients, with oxygen, with blood, or we have compromises like with cancer or AIDS, then muscles simply will not be maintained at the same high rate. Typically, we're going to try to treat muscle atrophy with exercise, get somebody moving if that was the issue. It could be correcting their nutritional issues, and even electrical stimulation of muscle. We might have to actually stimulate muscle with electricity to mimic the nervous effects, the nervous system effects of stimulation, so that muscle will contract and therefore will maintain adequate protein synthesis. That's it for this video. Thanks very much.